take it.
And we're not going to stop it. Also not going to stop it. Ash Hanley finishes it off.
Jack Bird with his first Leeds try.
Welcome back to Matchday Live, everybody. It's round 18 of the Betfred Super League, and Leeds Rhinos have headed over to the Stade Gilbert Brutus to take on the Catalans Dragons in what is set to be a great battle after a great weekend over in Liverpool for the Rhinos. A big win against the Bradford Bulls. They have headed over to France, looking to take down the Dragons, who they beat here at AMT Headingley back in round 9. A new Dragons side, though, under the stewardship of John Cartwright. It'll be interesting to see just how they go up against the Rhinos side today. My name's Dan Hawkhead. A pleasure to have your company. And I'm joined as usual by BBC Radio Leeds' Jack Conlon. Jack, it's been a really big week at the club. There's been lots going on. Let's cast our minds back just a little bit to Sunday. Yeah. Your thoughts on a great win over a great derby win, 50 points to 16 against the Bradford Bulls. A really stellar performance from the Rhinos, but maybe didn't get out of third gear?
Probably fair to say, yeah. It was another routine win, seemingly. First of all, Magic Weekend I thought was fantastic as an overall event, a new stadium, of course.
Agreed.
I thought that Hill Dickinson was really, really good. It really suited the event, I think. Big enough stadium. Really nice location, only about a 30-minute walk outside of Liverpool city centre. Plenty around it as well. The fan zone was really busy throughout the weekend. So I think, first of all, that was a fantastic event. But yeah, I think the Rhinos game, smack bang in the middle of that Sunday, was pretty routine. As you mentioned there, didn't really get out of third gear. Leeds had a bit of a scare, didn't they, in the sort of middle of the game when Bradford just started to get a bit of their own momentum. Probably similar to what we saw when Leeds played Toulouse a few weeks back, in that there was just that period where concentration seemed to dip a bit and it allowed the other team back into the game. But I think even with Bradford's little rally in that period, you couldn't see them going all the way and mounting a proper comeback, and Leeds quite quickly got a handle back on that game. So yeah, it was another routine win. Some really great individual performances. I mean, I think Ash Handley's the one that's come out of that game with the most plaudits, and rightly so, because he was absolutely fantastic. I think he's really this week got the sort of England centre conversation raging again, because he's absolutely in the picture, and I think in a lot of people's minds is probably the first choice centre for England at the minute, just on the basis of what he's done this year. So lots to like about that performance. It's another consistent. I know Brad Arthur keeps saying the word reliable, doesn't he? He wants them to be a reliable team. I think that's another game ticked off in that respect. They've turned up there on the big stage, on a big stage, and beaten their close local rivals at a canter. So yeah, I think there's it's another box ticked. There's still a long way to go for Leeds, but it was a routine win, and one that will have sent their fans home happy from Liverpool.
Added to quite a dramatic script, because when you think about that day in particular, so Wakefield win big. Then our game, granted, yes, a big scoreline for the Rhinos, but great to see the Bulls actually did rally in the game, gave something for their fans to chant about. And then the Wigan Saints game, we were talking pre-show, was just lights out rugby. It was tight, and that's what we wanted to show, isn't it? Is just how great it is. And I think the more the theatricals about Magic Weekend this year were just that little bit better. So big credit to the guys at Super League and the RLC, because it felt like a big occasion, didn't it, with all the pyro and all this, not just in bowl, as the teams were coming in. They made it a proper occasion for all these teams. They
didn't. I think the only drawback was, and I'm not the only one to say this week, weirdly enough, was at times the rugby, which And when I say that, I don't mean necessarily some of the quality of play or some of the tries that were scored, but I mean the contest really. The only real contest we got all weekend was Wigan Saints. Now, there's no perfect way, I don't think, of lining up a Magic Weekend fixture schedule to guarantee that every game is going to be tight. There's no perfect way of doing it, I don't think. And I've always certainly thought that Magic Weekend is a good weekend and a good occasion to bring out those rivalries and have it as a round of derbies, which may be looked at next season to try and eke out a bit more competitiveness out of each game. But that was probably the one slight disappointment or drawback. But regardless, I think I think it will go down as a success. Will the first Magic Weekend at Hill Dickinson, and they're going back there next year. That was confirmed over the weekend as well. So I think there's certainly foundations that have been laid there for what could be a bit of a rugby league hotbed, that stadium, and I don't think that's the first or the last time we're going to see rugby league at Hill Dickinson. I think we'll have more internationals there, like they had the Ashes. I think we'll have Magic Weekend there. Obviously next year, I reckon it'll be further on as well.
I agree.
So yeah, I do think that despite some of those blowout scorelines, which were a bit annoying. I think it was a successful weekend.
And a great way to kick off this last 10 fixtures that are going to be so crucial in the fight for the top 6, for the League Leaders Shield, which of course the Rhinos are involved in. The fight to get in the top 6. Look at today's opponents, Catalans Dragons, Lee Leopards are very much in the chasing pack. Magic Weekend in general, one to forget for our opponents today, the Catalan Dragons, a massive blowout loss to Toulouse. I don't think anyone quite saw them losing out by 60 points, to Olympique. It was a big result for Sylvain Hules' side, but looking at where the Dragons have been this year, we were saying it's one that started with a lot of optimism and just hasn't provided that at all for them.
They're such a strange side at times, Catalans, and I think touching on the game last week, that was the real shock of Magic Weekend, funnily enough, was the game that didn't happen at Hill Dickinson. It was the one that happened in France, and that most people probably watched on their tellies or on their phones or kept up with via the apps. That was, I know there was a fair bit of talk on the Sunday about that game because no one really expected that as a result, Toulouse to win first of all, but by that margin and that convincingly too, it really caught everyone by surprise. I think it was for the competition a good result, because I think it shows that Toulouse, as one of those newly promoted sides, can mix it when they want to, and I think that having that French rivalry between those two is only good for the competition. And you don't want it to always just be that one-sided rivalry. You don't want Catalans to always be the dominant force over there. So I think first of all, that was a fantastic result for Toulouse, but really disappointing for Catalans, and maybe a sort of mark of where those two French clubs are at the moment, in that Toulouse have got a squad largely made up of players that they brought up from the Championship with them. There's probably more of an assured identity about them as a club, whereas Catalans, again, in the off-season we saw a lot of turnover in players. That's likely going to happen again at the end of this season, with a couple of players already confirmed to be leaving. Toby Sexton being one of them. He was always only here for a year. Yes. Isaac Fasua-Malawi, who's already gone back to Australia on compassionate grounds, was another one that was already only here for a year. So there's a couple of sort of stopgap signings there that they made at the start of the season, and I don't think that's really helped them. But I think it's just sort of indicative of what we've sort of come to expect from Catalans in recent seasons. Is they are this sort of strange entity where players just seem, they've almost got a revolving door of transfers every single year. The turnover, or the regular turnover, surely is the most out of any Super League club, just for how much they churn that squad and how much they move players who are in pivotal positions. And it's always really surprising, I think, just the amount of times they do it now. Up until seemingly the last couple of seasons, it's worked to a degree, and they've managed to manufacture some success out of it. But I think we're really seeing now that possibly catch up on them, and that lack of continuity, barring a handful of players, it can't be good. I don't think, and I think that's why, again, we've seen an underwhelming Catalans team, because for all the star power that they've got individually, if you've not got that over a prolonged period of time, then it's very hard to actually eke out any success, and I think that is where their real drawback has been and where they've fallen down this season.
And it's even harder when you change I know when you change head coach mid-season, it's never helpful, but John Cartwright's going to want new players or players that fit his style of system that Joel Tompkins didn't have wanted, so that's going to be another element for next year.
Precisely, yeah, and they've had 3 coaches now in a year.
It's
on the back of McNamara, then Joel Tompkins, then John Cartwright.
Or if you try to jam in Ryan Sheridan on an interim basis.
Absolutely, yeah, 4. I think that's absolutely fair to say. 4 different coaches in the span of a year is not good, again, for any club. This isn't just a knock on Catalans. That's just not... That just doesn't breed success, that, when you are changing, pieces that much. Not only players, like I mentioned, but as you mentioned, their coaches as well. So, yeah, I think continuity is what Catalans need, but that's what they've also struggled to find for a fair old while now. And the model that they have got, that seemingly prefers that churn of players and to move players on and to I don't know if you'd call it being a stopgap, but how many players do we see from Australia now go over to Catalan, rather than come to one of the English Super League clubs, or similarly, how many English players are we now seeing going out there as well? It's a desirable place to go and live, as well as play rugby. But I think for them, as a club, I think success needs to be built over a few years on the back of the same or a similar group of players. No squad is going to stay together as an entirety for years. That's just not going to happen because of the way that sport is. But if they can keep a core group for a fair old while and build on probably some of the local French talent they've got there. I mean, there's a good handful that are coming through now. Espero Bichet, I think, is at the forefront of that as one of those.
So impressive.
Oh, he's so good. I mean, I think he's suspended at the minute, isn't he? But he's a fantastic talent, and he's one of those you'd hope they will build a club around. I think that's probably the way to go for Catalans. But yeah, it's been another underwhelming season for them.
Leo Dorelator, Alexis Lees, Lenny Mark, just a couple of those other
good
names
handful
as well.
Yeah.
There's quite a few that are coming through. It's great to see. But at the same time, they're saying goodbye to talisman of the Catalans club. He's been at, I think it's over 300 games. Ben Garcia announcing his retirement this week. He'll be a big miss going into next year, but just for his leadership more than that, on the field rather than obviously just being part of that big pack, he'll be a massive miss for next year. But
he will
obviously want to go out on a high too.
Without a doubt, and I think he's one of those that, one of the very, very few players that has been there throughout it all. Other than I remember him having that one sort of year spell at Penrith in the NRL years back. But other than that, he's always been a Catalans player. He's part of the furniture at that club. So yeah, he's been a superb servant to Super League, a superb servant to French Rugby League as well. A real sort of pioneer of that club, and one that very much carried the baton from those that started out Catalan Super League journey way back in 2007, was it, or 6 or 7?
2006.
2006. Which again is crazy to think they've been a Super League club for 20 years. But Benjamin Garcia has been part of that squad for over half of that, so that just tells you how much of an impact he's had on that club. So yeah, he'll be a huge miss. But will always, I think, be considered as one of the real talisman of French Rugby League, certainly in the modern era.
And speaking of players leaving, let's move on to just a bit of the news that's happening at the Rhinos this week. So obviously, we had the announcement that Ethan O'Neill has left to go to Hull FC. All our best to Ethan. Just a shame we didn't quite see as much of Ethan in a Rhinos shirt, but as we touched about on previous episodes, kind of that's what happens when you've got a squad like Brad Arthur's had this year. That's not a lot of injuries. That's had Chris Hankinson mauled himself into a second rower that none of us saw at the start of pre-season. So all our best to Ethan, of course. A new incoming, though. Really excited to see Dylan Walker coming in 2027. Had a great announcement this week. Para fans, Jack, really disappointed that they're losing him for next year. A coup of a signing then for the Rhinos.
I think it's a really smart bit of business. I really do. I think he adds experience. He's 31 years old. He's got plenty of runs on the board in the NRL. He's played for Australia. He's played for New South Wales in Origin. He comes with a really good bit of pedigree. And I think he'll be a really important signing at a time when the Rhinos are losing some of those more experienced heads. You look at the players that are leaving next season to go to Perth. A couple that are leaving to go to other Super League clubs. I think a signing like that, really will add a lot to the club, not just on the field in what he brings, but also off the field. And when it comes to help him bring through that next crop of youngsters, of which there are a lot. Brad Arthur, I think, has made no bones about the fact that next season will probably see the emergence, or it'll give the backing to some of those younger players. I mean, George Brown is being tipped for the 6 shirt. He seems like the first choice standoff going into 2027. I think Dylan Walker's a good signing in that if that doesn't work, and I say that, if George Brown needs a couple of extra years to just hone his craft and turn into a regular Super League player, you've got the likes of a Dylan Walker. Jack Bird is another option there who can fill in at standoff. He's got that utility value. He's played a lot of loose forward, certainly in recent years. Started out as centre, I remember, at South Sydney. Ended up playing a fair bit of 6, has then moved into loose forward. He's almost followed the Callum Watkins trajectory in that sense. Just migrating inwards. But I think he will add a lot to this Leeds side next season. As I say, at a time when they are losing a fair few experienced heads, he very much replenishes that going into 2027. And I think in their first 2 bits of incoming business, in him and Morgan Gannon, I think that's 2 really, really smart signings. I think they do still need some more.
Okay.
And I imagine we probably will see some more. But I think it's 2 bits of business to be done already, especially as well when you sort of look at who this week has been announced as leaving as well, in Ethan O'Neill and likely Jeremiah Matauti at the end of the season. Yeah, I think it's a really smart bit of business.
And coming on, obviously with Dylan Walker, such a great offload, as we saw in the game against Manly. It was ironic that absolutely blew up on social media, and the next day the club announced his signing. It was almost the perfect storyline to go straight into it. Focusing on the Dragons and looking at we'll take you through the 21-man squads now, because it's an interesting look. Speaking of also incomings at Catalans, they've included Roger Smith, who's coming in off he's played a little bit at Carcassonne, came through at Sydney Roosters. He's in potentially for his first appearance. He's 1 or 2 changes for Catalans this week, but not. Maybe Frank Maria, you'd maybe say he's dropping into the side, but it should be sort of the same amount of team that played against Toulouse last time out.
You'd imagine so, yeah. I think the 2 lads that have dropped out are Lenny Mark and Giovanni Descalzi, who are younger players that were sort of there probably just to bulk out the 21 last week. Neither played. Whereas in Frank Maria and Eden Rogers-Smith, you've got 2 players who, one in Frank Maria that we know all about. He's a hard-hitting middle. He's in the 11 shirt, so can play on a bit of an edge. He's a utility forward, and he's a good option for them. You then look at Eden Rogers-Smith, who is a bit more of an unknown quantity.
He really is. I don't know much about him.
No, likewise. I had a quick Google this week, and it seems that he's played a fair bit of State Cup over in Australia. Like you mentioned, he spent a bit of time in the Sydney Roosters system before going over to France and coming through with Carcassonne. Again, there's a good. I think the Elite 1 competition in France is a really interesting sort of place to look at. When you look down squads, there's the odd player that sort of jumps out at you as. I didn't know he was there.
Theo Farge, I was surprised about this week.
There's so many like that. I mean, Conrad Hurrell, who is retired now, but he finished his career there, and but at the same time, you've got players, that are going there after having already made a name for themselves, but also you've got a good handful of younger Australian or New Zealanders that are also going into that competition to just try and, I guess, build their profile or do something a bit different, try something a bit new. And, he's clearly made an impression to the point where Catalans have picked him up and could be back to give him a Super League debut. So, what a moment that would be for him. As I say, he's an unknown quantity, really. Similar to Maria, funnily enough, plays a bit of middle, plays a bit of edge. But, yeah, very much an unknown quantity. So will be one to keep an eye out on if he does make his debut, that is.
And looking at the Rhinos 21-man squad, just the 1 change this week, Ryan Hall dropping out and Alfie Edgell coming in makes an interesting debate for what that right edge is going to look like now for Leeds. Is he going to go with Riley Lum? Is he going to go with Alfie Edgell? Let us know in the comments. Comment who do you think is going to start on that right edge out of those 2. Jack, who is your thought?
I think it'll be Riley Lum. I think Brad Arthur hinted at that. I say hinted, he almost, as he tends to do in his press conferences, he just sort of said, it'll be Riley that plays. So barring any sort of late drama or late changes, Riley Lum, it looks like, will be the player that takes up that right wing spot, which I think is smart. I think when Ryan Hall went off last week at Magic Weekend, the big debate was, what is going to happen next week? Will it just be 1-for-1 change, i.e. a Lum or an Edgell coming on that right edge for Ryan Hall? Will it be Chris Hankinson, who fills that spot again, you know, and a back row brought in. Will Jack Bird come back into the reckoning? You know, there was options there, but I'm very much on board with Brad Arthur's philosophy of, you know, just like for like replacements. You know, let's just give someone else a chance, as opposed to trying to move a lot of pieces around and unsettling other areas of the pitch, because I think sometimes coaches are caught out by that, you know, trying to perhaps overthink what a replacement should be, and moving too many of their other players about that, as I say, then unsettles everyone else. So yeah. I'm very much on board with. I mean, a good example is when Lockie Miller had that 3-game suspension, as opposed to, again, perhaps moving Hankinson to full back, moving someone else into the back row. It was, no, we're playing Fergie McCormack. And this is very, very similar in that, no, Riley Lum gets that shout. Everyone else will more than likely stay the same. He said, you know, there might be a couple of changes to the forward pack, who starts, who's on the bench, you know, which we've seen a lot of this season. But otherwise, barring Lum, it'll be the same other 16 players that played at Magic Weekend. That very much seems like what it'll be. So, yeah, I'm well on board with that as a philosophy, and I think it's a very sensible approach to picking your team.
And he's not you're not steering Riley Lum into a position he's not done before, in that he scored plenty of tries playing reserves rugby this year, so he's definitely, I'll say, on that merit earned the opportunity, but filled in quite. He's not Mike Acevo. We know he's not Mike Acevo, but still filled in pretty well for Michael last year. So actually, in terms of his development and getting him actually into the team, you know, this is an opportunity for him to say at Brad. And Brad's been one of those this year that said, once you get your spot, you know, you've got to earn it back, haven't you? So,
100%.
And if Riley puts on a show, Ryan's got to earn his spot back. Like Ryan also said on the podcast this week, on the Leeds Rhinos podcast. You can listen back to that after this, of course. But it is all about that competition. So it'll be good to see just how it goes.
Without a doubt, and I think, again, a good example of that is Harry Newman and Jack Bird. I mean,
yes.
Jack Bird hasn't played in several weeks now for Leeds, despite being fit, and that is just as a result of Harry Newman playing so well, having got his opportunity on the back of Bird's injury. So, yeah, that is just very much the ethos this season, isn't it? And it's working. You know, it's clearly working, given where Leeds are in the table, the form they're in, the performances they're putting out there, the rugby they're playing. You know, that is clearly something that they've all bought into. You know, not for a minute am I saying that Jack Bird is happy, you know, not playing week in, week out, but at the same time, I imagine that there is an acknowledgement that just is the way that this team and this club runs at the minute under Brad Arthur, is that if you are playing well enough and you are in that 17 already, then, you know, it takes something to lose your spot. You know, that is just the way that they are working, and as I say, yeah, it's worked seemingly, and I think in the case of Jack Bird, there's not many other Super League sides. He probably gets into just about every other Super League side at the minute, but not Leeds, because there's 2 centres there that are playing lights out rugby, so that's just the way it is.
I'm really interested to see, by the way, how he goes with Dylan Walker next year, because like you said, they're both pretty seasoned NRL veterans, both played rep honours. I'm really interested to see just how those two pair up, not on an edge, but just in terms of the dynamic of Jack being so explosive as he is, Dylan doing his bits up front. But that's a conversation for next year. Catalans Dragons. You mentioned obviously back at the start of the show about just how many names come in. All 3 of our key players today, all have come in this year. Let's start with Charlie Staines, because he's a player that when they signed him, I was a bit shocked. You know, he's got such a great pedigree coming through from Penrith. Didn't quite work at Wests for him. He's statistically one of the better players in the league this year, but for some reason just isn't quite making the Catalan side tick. Maybe it's an Eric thing, maybe it's just, you know, a form of a team. But your thoughts on Charlie, what he can do today?
I think that is very much indicative of what the rest of the Catalan side is like at the minute, and no one is really playing exceptional rugby, full stop. And, you know, it's very difficult. I think he has been their standout player this year, without a doubt. I think, again, statistically, which, you know, statistics only give you one side of a story, I always think, but he is one of the better players. He's leading Super League for carries and metres, you know, so he clearly gets through a lot of work. You know, and he's a player that is constantly trying to inject himself into a game and make a difference. But if those around you and those that are distributing the ball to you aren't playing at their best, then it's hard for him to have as much impact. And that is just the case in rugby league in general. And I think the fact that Lewis Dodd and Toby Sexton haven't fired as much as they'd perhaps hoped, has then stunted what Staines can do. I think that's just all, as I say, a result of everyone not playing at their best. So I still do think that he, as I say, has been their best player this year, by a way as well, by some margin. And he is one that if Catalans are to cause Leeds any problems, I think he's one of the first players that you'd expect to do so. They've got a couple of strike weapons. I mean, when they came here and played Leeds, we talked about Solomon Fatapi in the build-up, who again, when he's on, is another strike centre, another strike player, but hasn't probably been on enough this season. He's had a couple of really poor games, and that has caught him out. But I think Staines is probably the one that has stayed at just about a consistent level. And that you'd be willing to say, if the opportunity ever came up for other clubs to sign him, he'd be the one that you'd probably look at, and he'd have the most market value. So yeah, I think he's the standout for me for Catalans is Charlie Staines. It's just everyone else needs to sort of hit a similar level on a consistent basis.
What's really impressed me as well about him taking results out of the window is actually his return play. There was a opportunity against Bradford where, yes, it was a poor kick from, I believe it was Nicarima. He came out from the back of his own line, grabbed the ball, ended up going the full length of the field to score a try. He's a man that once you give him, and scored a similar try against Hull, once you give him a bit of space, he absolutely flies, doesn't he?
He does, and he's bulked up a lot as well, I think, in recent seasons. I remember him coming through at Penrith, and he was still quite skinny, still very much a young kid, and was part of that fantastic school of players that they've got over at Penrith, that just keeps producing talent year in, year out. He was very much part of that, but got his opportunity and did just look like a skinny but quick winger / fullback, whereas now that he's sort of matured a bit and grown, he's sort of filled his body out and is now quite a bulky fullback that does go well, but has still managed to keep that pace, which I think is the crucial part for him. So yeah, he can turn it on when he does get some space, and can be a real threat. As I say, it's just a case of everyone else hitting those same levels, but he is their main threat, in my opinion.
It'd be interesting just to see how he goes under John Cartwright next year. It'd be really great with a full season under him, actually, what that looks like. Another player, I would argue as well, who's been very much on for Catalans this season is Toby Sexton. You mentioned him earlier on. Quite remarkable in terms of just his impact. It's a shame we're going to not see him next year because he's been so crucial to how Catalans work. But as a halfback, so impressive just the way he leads the side around the field, creates opportunities for other players, whether it's kicking, whether it's passing. He's not a head-to-head this week, but him up against Jake Connor, we touch on the halfbacks most weeks, but that'll be a really great fight today.
You'd hope so, and I think Sexton's a really interesting player because it was a bit controversial in leaving Canterbury last season.
Yes.
When he did, they ended up with 3 halfbacks there, and he ended up being the odd one out despite having played well for the first half of their season, and very much being that settling head that performed really well for them. So, it was a real pick-up for Catalans when they were getting him, even just for the one season, which, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think is a sustainable way of building a squad. He's getting players just for a sole season. He's one of those that goes to Perth Bears next year. He'll be teamed up with Harry Newman, Mikel Ilecki, James McDonald.
Get to know him very well.
I was going to say, future teammates coming up against each other in this game this weekend. So, yeah, when he's on, he's a fantastic player to watch because he seems to play at a different speed to everyone else, and he just dictates that pace. It's almost like slow motion for him at times because the way he carries the ball and the way that he distributes and the way that he just sees the game, is like, as I say, at a different pace to everybody else. And yeah, he can have such an effect on the game when he plays well, and that is the crucial bit. Again, we're caveating a lot of these Catalans players by saying when they play well they are very good, but they've just not done it enough this season. So that's been what has really held Catalans back for me. I think him and Lewis Dodd, again, when they've been on, have looked really nice as a partnership. Lewis Dodd, I think, is Catalans' leader for assists this season. I think 14 tries he's laid on for other players. So it's good to see him getting back to a bit of form. And alongside Sexton, on paper, there is a really good halves combination there. It's just doing it enough and showing that on a consistent basis that has really been those two individuals their downfall.
Not to pick on certain areas, but do you think that's why Catalans haven't been great, or had maybe the consistency they've had in previous years? Because you've had Sexton, who's been as good as he has been, but then has off days. You've got Dodd that doesn't quite line up with when those off days happen. That because those two have been sort of building and crafting this relationship over the course of the year, that actually have not been able to be as seasoned as, say, Brodie Croft and Jake Connor be looking at the sort of stellar halves in the league. They've not been able to do that, which is sort of why Catalans have not been able to get the result. Would you put it down to that?
Not just those two, but I think it's a very fair point in that when it comes down to building that squad, when you look at your halves, how much better this season do Brodie Croft and Jake Connor look?
Yes.
You know, after playing most of a season already together, having a full pre-season together, and this year they look like a completely different entity. Whereas you throw Dodd and Sexton together, yes, they've had a pre-season together, but the real acid test of any halves partnership is what happens when you get out on the field, naturally. And, you know, they've had enough runs on the board this season to, you'd think, work out what that combination is. But I do still think they are behind a fair few other halves in the league in that sense, just in the fact that they've not had as much time spent together. So, yeah, I think you could put it down to that, but I think that's indicative of the whole squad as well. And again, just that churn of players and the fact that, you know, Catalans have had a big overhaul in the off-season, are probably going to have another one this season, and, you know, will you know, there's a fair potential that they'll be in the same position this time next year, where they're a pretty, you know, mid-table club that are possibly preparing for another big recruitment cycle. So they are just such an interesting and odd team at times, Catalans, to sort of observe from a distance. But yeah, I do think when you look at the halves, having that consistency is absolutely the key point, and that is why I think if you look at the two halves this weekend in isolation, Connor and Croft are the ones that you'd much rather have in the team.
I find it ironic that, you know, you look at the experience of Dodd, you look at the experience of Sexton, that it's not been able to work. But anyway, last on our top three, Kruise Leeming, familiar to obviously Rhinos fans from his time over here. An odd late move when he was signed on loan from Wigan. Ollie Partington going in the opposite direction. Very much when you watch the footage, when you watch how they played this year, very much the Kruise Leeming you'd expect. Darting out of dummy half, making sure his runs out of dummy half have been, you know, direct. They've been crucial. Ironically, a drop goal against Toulouse in a big win earlier in the campaign. Just sometimes gets lost in games, though, doesn't he, Kruise? And that's where his maybe slight downfall is, and he's not been able to sort of produce that for Catalan this year, but definitely been one of their top players. Yeah,
he's a player that's bounced about quite a bit, hasn't he, throughout his career? Huddersfield, Leeds, Wigan, Catalan now. You know, he's never really seemed to just find a home and find somewhere where he's settled. I think he's had a fair bit of game time this season, or starting game time, which I think has always been what he has chased, is that starting role, and he's never really managed to find it. He had a period at Huddersfield where he did, but he always seems to be the impact hooker. And I know when he was at Leeds, that obviously is what he turned into eventually. You know, on the back of, I think it was Jared O'Connor who was coming through at that point, and, you know, was the preferred starter, and Leeming came off the bench just as an impact player to speed up the ruck, and very much had that role. So yeah, he's never really found a place where he can just constantly start and do his work. But this season, you know, I think just due to injury, if nothing else, you know, because Catalans have no Alvarez da Costa at the minute, he's out. So
another that's leaving as well at the end of the year.
Exactly, yeah. I think Leeming's, you know, finally found, you know, by coincidence if nothing else, just a bit of regular starting game time. I think that's really helped him. You know, he is very much doing what Kruise Leeming does best, which is quick out the ruck, a workhorse in the middle when it comes to defensive, you know, the defensive side of the game as well. And you know, he's proved to be a pretty decent pickup for Catalans this season. Again, he's one of those that we don't know where he stands at the end of the year. It's only initially a season-long loan from Wigan. There's probably potential to make that a permanent at Catalans, and I'd be surprised if they don't explore that. But yeah, he's another one that has sort of been drafted in pretty late, has had to sort of make as much of an impact as he can, at short notice, but has actually turned out to be a good signing for them. You know, Super League experience in the middle, a dependable pair of hands at hooker without a doubt, and someone who can add something on both sides of the ball. So yeah, he's been a tidy player for them this season.
He's Catalans' top tackler this year, so which is a key to his defensive efforts as well, and that's one of those I know we've highlighted when we talked about Leeds players about doing the Bradford, last week we talked about players that do defence and do attack. Kruise Leeming very much in that ilk. Moving on to our head-to-head, and we have gone into the forward pack this week. We've picked out some props, and one of the stars of the Rhinos in recent weeks, Jack Mikolaj Ledsky, was man of the match against Hull KR. I'm interested to pick your brain just how you think that this year is compared with Mikolaj Ledsky's previous years at Leeds.
Good question. I think it's probably the best we've seen of him, and you know the bar is pretty high because I think for years now he's been one of the more consistent props for Leeds. You know, he coming through the academy, I think he was always a player that you saw as having that first team potential. You know, certainly without a doubt he had the size and the strength. I think it was always a case though of just converting himself from a big academy player into a big Super League first team player, and you know, thankfully he did that pretty quickly for Leeds. Yeah, over the years he's just constantly delivered. I think there's been moments of adversity, I think, where he's perhaps not hit the heights that he had hoped, and he's been in and out of the England picture, for example, but I think this season he's been a completely different animal, and he has led from the front in, you know, a pack that has been absolutely outstanding. You know, all season, a consistent pack as well. Let's not forget, which again is another point that we bring up most weeks, the fact that Leeds have managed to go through the season without too many big injuries. And they've been able to keep that middle unit generally pretty healthy. Ledsky, Palacia, Jenkins, Holroyd had a bit of time out of the squad, didn't he? But equally, he's been brilliant both before his injury and after it.
That's where Cassell's come in, of course.
Exactly. So you know, there's always been that sort of 3 or 4 players that are consistent parts of that middle unit. But I think he's absolutely led from the front. You know, I think I spoke last week about that group of Leeds players who, particularly those that are going over to Perth Bears at the end of the season, who will be wanting to finish here on a high. Ledsky, who came through the academy, Newman, who came through the academy, McDonnell, who was signed from Wigan, but very much has made his name at Leeds. For me, looking from the outside in, that means something to those players. The fact that, you know, they're about to finish up their time at a club that has done so much for them, and there's a determination to give something back to the club, I think. And Ledsky, for me, I think when you look at him, when you see his interviews and stuff, you hear him speak, you know, he's got that sort of cheeky chappy vibe about him.
He really does.
But you can tell that he has loved his time here, and he's still loving his time here for, you know, the rest of this season until that point comes when he'll depart and go to Perth. So I think for him it means so much, and I think that is probably in part why we've seen such an upturn in performances and such a consistency and such a consistent intensity. You know, he never drops his game at the minute, and you've seen that all season. He's constantly at a level, and you know, he's picked up a couple of tries along the way as well, which I'm sure is a nice little bonus. So yeah, he's just been so good for Leeds, not just this season, but down the years. But I think we're seeing him at a different level in 2026.
I'll throw some stats at you. He's up at 90% for his tackle efficiency this year, which is one of the best in his career. And post-contact meters wise, I was watching funny enough, the Hull KR, I was looking at some clips from Mick from that game, and you just see why he won man of the match against St Helens, but in both those home games here at AMT Headingley, you can absolutely see why he was one of the picks for man of the match in terms of the way that he seems to now bounce out of tackles. And not that we've never not seen it before with Mick. We know, like you say, that he's grown into this big Super League prop, but he's starting to throw players left, right and centre. He was doing it against Warrington. Tavita Pangai Jr., not a problem, out my way. You know, he's actually turned into one of the league's best forwards, which is just, I think it's testament to Brad Arthur's and Jamie Langley and Scott Grix's work, obviously, behind the scenes. But for Mick, whether he wanted the opportunity to go to the NRL, he's definitely, you know, put himself in the shop window for, you know, new contracts, a move elsewhere. He's put himself in that window with some great performances this year.
Without a doubt, and I think people often say about forwards and props in particular, don't they, that they tend to come into their prime in the late 20s, and he is just about hitting that now. He's 27, I think I'm right in saying. You know, he's spent plenty of years now properly learning the ropes and getting to grips with what being a regular Super League first teamer is like. And I think we're finally seeing that all come to fruition, albeit in his final season in Super League. And as a Rhinos player, but you know, I said again last week that almost like this squad is putting all their eggs in one basket, and that, you know, given who is leaving at the end of the year, this seems like a really, really big opportunity, especially with how the season's gone so far, especially given Leeds are 4 points clear at the top now, to really mount a charge on that Super League title. And I think he's one of those that, again, having been part of this squad for so long, will be so hungry for that. And as I say, I think we're seeing that now in his performances, and the fact that he is now one of the senior members of the squad, one of the senior members of that pack. He's leading from the front, where in the past he, as perhaps in one of the younger parts of that, that's not the case now. You know, he is a leader of that pack, and there is absolutely no doubt about it, and you can see that week in, week out when he plays. And
opposite him is Josh Allen, one of a few props that have managed to stay on the field this year quite a lot for the Dragons. He's, again, topping tackles for the Dragons this year. A great pickup from, I believe it was State Cup competitions that he came from, and he's one of those that's really hit the ground running in, he's only 25 as well. He's a perfect age to come into this Catalan system. Were your thoughts on how he's been this year?
Yeah, as you mentioned, they're a player that came through the State Cup system, the reserve grade over in Australia, and was picked up as a bit of an unknown quantity this year. And I think, you know, we've seen a good handful of players who, you know, benefit in Super League from perhaps coming in under the radar, and he's definitely one of them. He's been, as you mentioned there, one of the more consistent performers for Catalans. They've had so much in and out, week in, week out, with injuries and suspensions and stuff, that he's managed to just stay the right line of all of that and be a consistent part. They used him as a sub for the first chunk of the season. He was coming off the bench a fair bit and trying to add some impact, but he's ended up being a regular starter in the past few weeks, past couple of months for them. So yeah, he's quite a stocky forward. He's a powerful forward. I think played a fair bit of loose forward over in Australia, but is very much a prop or a hard hitting middle. So yeah, he's one player that's managed to, as I mentioned, keep his place on the field throughout 2026 for the most part. And you know, in a Catalan side that has seen as much change as it has, players like that I think have been so important for them to just, you know, keep rolling on and try and you know, mount some sort of consistent performance, which they have struggled to do, but not for the want of trying when it comes to the likes of Josh Allen. Do
you think he fits John Cartwright's system? If from seeing what we have seen of when he was at Hull, John Cartwright, not Josh Allen, obviously. Do you think he fits that system?
I think he does, yeah, and I think he'll be a player that they keep around. I'm not sure exactly what his contract situation is, but I'd be surprised if he doesn't play for Catalans next season. Again, as one of those players that will, you'd imagine, be a pretty prominent part of their forward pack, be it as a starter or as a bench player. With Catalan, you never really know what those targets are going to be when it comes to recruitment, so who knows where he'll end up falling in that sort of pecking order when they do sort of make some moves for forwards. But yeah, I would absolutely imagine him to be part of their squad next season. I don't imagine he'll be too much on their cap either, so I think he's a really, really, a good player to have as part of their squad. And when I say that, that's not taken away from what he does actually add as a player either. You know, yes, he is probably one of the lower earners amongst those forwards, but at the same time, he's packed a punch and more than held his own, I think, in their forward pack this year.
I'd argue that he fits the mould of your Roman Navarrete, your Busquets, that, yeah, they've become regular names out on the field, but they don't do anything flashy, do they? They can just get the job done, the hard working, all that. I can't believe I've waited to this slot until just at the end of the show to mention it, but obviously this is the first time that Leeds obviously hope to post points in Catalans, having not in the last 2 years especially. It's been a tough place to go and not just take Leeds points away, but actually score points for the Rhinos. How do you see, judging that this is very much a different Brad Arthur side to what we saw, that the one that went out early in the start of last year, the one that hasn't won since 2022, in that playoff win, how do you see today's game going as a general gist of, you know, how tough it is going out to Catalan and etc.?
It's a bogey team and a bogey venue, seemingly, isn't it, for Leeds going out there? But yeah, like you say, I think it's completely different this time around. You know, you look at the way that this Leeds team are travelling, how self-assured they are, how confident they are in what they're doing. I would expect the winning run to continue. And they've got quite a favourable run in the next few weeks with some of the games they've got coming up, but I mean, I think when it comes to sort of going to Catalans and Toulouse, it's the logistics and the travel that sometimes do play a part, and you know that may be the only thing that could derail Leeds, because at the minute they are a juggernaut that are hard to stop, and I don't see Catalans, you know, being the kind of team having the ability to stop Leeds. I really don't. You know, they'll put up a fight, absolutely they will. I think Leeds need to make sure they keep that concentration for the full 80 and don't allow another Toulouse or another Bradford where, yes, they do end up coming away with the points and pretty convincingly, but they have that little lapse and that little dip in the middle of the game and just invite the opposition back in. I think if they can avoid that, I think it should be another pretty routine win for Leeds.
John Cartwright, they'll be thinking, I've already beaten Leeds once this year. It's only him and Darryl Powell up in that list, but let's we'll brush that one to one side. If you have headed over to the Stade Gilbert Brutus, we hope you have a great game day. Always nice and fun in the sun. We've thankfully got it here at AMT Headingley and back in Leeds too. Hopefully a win, like we say, for you guys. If you're not out in Catalan and wanting to watch the game, there's two ways to do that. Sorry, you can watch on Sky Sports for a bonus stream this week. So on the Rugby League category on Now TV and Sky, or we're also on Super League Plus for you subscribers on there too. If you want all the post-match information, all the player interviews, all the highlights from the game, head over to our YouTube channel at LEEDS RHINOS, also across X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok for all the latest, all the big content coming out from around the ground. Well, team news is coming next. My thanks as always to Jack Conlon for his insight. We really hope you enjoy this one. Also enjoy the England game after this one. A great day of sport for you guys coming up after the Rhinos taking on the Dragons. I've been Dan Hawkhead, and team news, like I say, is coming next.